We're going to be learning about cell theory and the scientists that helped to create cell theory. So in your journal, you should now have some pages of Cornell notes and prepared for taking notes on cell theory. Robert Hooke was a scientist back in 1665, and he had learned how to make a compound microscope. Compound means that it has two lenses put kind of over on top of each other. So he was looking through the compound microscope, and he took little tiny things to look at, and one thing that he happened to look at was cork. Cork is like a bark of the tree, and when he looked at this dried cork, he noticed that it had these little boxes in it, little compartments, and he thought that it looked like the rooms in a big monastery. A monastery is where monks lived, and they had solitude in those little rooms, and so he thought this was what they called cells, and he gave them the name as cells. It looks like there's little cells here. And so this is one of his actual drawings that he made. So you see how the detail is, the shading, the preciseness, every detail of it. That is the kind of drawings that I would like to see you do in our science class whenever we look under the microscope. So in your Cornell notes, I'd like for you to set it up where you have your line drawn, and your questions are going to be on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side you're going to write the different scientists that we are going to be learning about today. And so this picture right here of Robert Hooke, you see that he looks different from the last slide. In this picture right here, he has a wig on. So whenever they would go to speak to professional events or where there were going to be dignitaries, they would always wear their wigs, because remember, back then people did not have good hygiene. They didn't have ways to wash their hair very easily, and they often smelled, and so sometimes they would have to put these wigs on to kind of cover up. This is one of my favorite curious people, and I don't call him a scientist because he really wasn't a trained scientist. Anton von Leeuwenhoek. He was a fabric trader who would go around and look at different weavers' fabrics to see if they had little knots in them or if their fabric was fine and smooth. And he would select the finest fabrics for the royalty to make clothes out of, or drapery. And that was his actual training and his skills. And he finally made this cool little microscope that he carried in his pocket, and he used this handheld microscope to look at everything he was so curious about. Like as he walked down the road, he would pick up things on the side of the road, or he would scrape the gunk off of his teeth and look at it under his little microscope. He would look at blood when he pulled a scab off, or when he would look at the scab, and he started noticing that things would move, like when he was looking at pond water, and he was like, wow, there's something moving in that water. And so he would tell people that, and they were like, you're crazy, that's not true, you're not a trained scientist. Well, he named these little things animalcules, and he drew like 200 of the little things he saw in the water, in blood, in under the microscope that he used with it when he looked at his teeth scrapings. And so he started trying to get people to believe him, but no one would. So he sent the information that he had found to his friend Robert Hooke. Now, Robert Hooke was a scientist. So when he started looking at things with his microscope and he started seeing these things move, people started listening to him because he was a scientist with a reputation. So then there goes this 150-year gap between people looking at cells, and then nothing really happens. And a lot of that, the reason was because of a belief called spontaneous generation, that something could come from essentially something else. And so like if a farmer brought in his clothes and he dropped his wool pants on the floor, and there was some corn in his pocket. The next morning he got up to put his pants on and a mouse jumped out. He thought that the mouse actually came from his clothing because there would be a hole there, and they thought that that wool changed into a mouse. Well, that seems crazy to us to think that, because we know different now, but then a lot of people didn't. Or if they left food out and then the next day they got up and there was maggots crawling on it, they thought that food changed into the maggots, when in actuality we know that flies laid eggs and that happened. But that was the reason that there was a big gap in the studies of cells. So in the early 1800s, a man named Louis Pasteur, and you may know that name just because you know something that he did, he designed an experiment that unequivocally proved that spontaneous generation did not happen. He set up these tubes of glass that were curved, and he had broth in one of the flasks, and no air or no bugs or anything could get into this container. So Louis Pasteur, he boiled the broth until it killed any bacteria that would have been in the container and let it sit for a couple of weeks, and still nothing came out of the container, nothing grew in the container, the broth was still clear. And so he proved that something like broth or meat or wool cannot grow something else. That organism has to come from its own kind. So he disproved spontaneous generation. Now, what you know Louis Pasteur for is that he was the first man to pasteurize milk so that it wouldn't spoil so quickly. Pasteurization was bringing the temperature to a high temperature so that it was almost boiling, and then it would kill any bacteria that was in it, and the milk would last for many more days by doing pasteurization. And the Germans, they were known for using very good lenses and making very good lenses for their microscopes and telescopes. And so there was a lot of interest in looking at tiny microscopic things. And one of those Germans was a botanist that worked at a university named Matthias Schleiden. And he studied plants, and he noticed that there were these little containers and little boxes in all the plants that he looked at. He would take pieces of the leaves and crush them, and stems and crush them, and look at them under the microscope. And sure enough, he came up with the idea that all plants had these little boxes in them, and he said that they must be made of cells. So he contributed that part to the cell theory. Now, one of Schleiden's friends was named Theodor Schwann, and he studied animal tissue like muscles and skin and how things moved in the body. So he was a physiologist, and he was a friend of Schleiden's, and he started looking at these muscles. Now, he didn't see the boxy shapes that Schleiden saw, but he saw containers, like some of them were long and skinny and some of them may have been round, but he got to noticing, and there was always this little dot in the middle of them, and so he's like, these may be composed of cells as well. And so he contributed the idea that all animals were made of cells. Now, I remember Schwann's name because he was a biologist that studied animals, and Schwann reminds me of the word swan, which is an animal. So I remember that Schwann contributed to the cell theory by saying that all animals were made of cells. Rudolf Virchow was a pathologist who studied diseases, and one of the diseases he was studying was typhoid. And he often did autopsies. He's the first person who did autopsies to see how that person died. And so as he studied the diseases, he wanted to know, why did in a family one person got typhoid fever, then another person got it, and another person. So everybody in that family would eventually die from the disease or contract it. But if they left that place and they were separated, they didn't get the disease. So he was very interested in this study. And what he found out, and he just started thinking about, was there's something that lets this grow inside the body. Well, he happened to know a man named Robert Remack and was probably browsing around his office one day, and lo and behold saw that Robert Remack had written on some papers about how one cell produces another cell. And so he was the one who actually discovered that part, but he had not published it yet. And Virchow, he immediately jumped on it and said, that's what is happening. These typhoid bacteria are reproducing in this person's body. So then if a person touches another person, they get contaminated. So Virchow kind of stole another person's idea, but he published it, and he was a great scientist, and he was one of the first to ever do autopsies, and he started a lot of reform in the medical field, especially in hospitals, where he realized that hygiene was the way to keep other people from getting sick. So he demanded that changes happen, that every doctor had to scrub down before they were able to operate. And so he contributed to the cell theory by saying that cells come from pre-existing cells. The basic components of the cell theory are that all living things, plants and animals, are made of cells, and that the cell is the basic unit of structure and function. It's the smallest living thing. And finally, Virchow gave us the part about all cells coming from pre-existing cells.